On March 6, 1944, at 28,000 feet over Brandenburg, Germany, Major Hans Kogler's oxygen mask felt frozen to his face. He looked out at the clear sky from his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6's cockpit, guiding his group of various fighters. They were flying toward a stream of bombers that his ground team had assured him would be alone and unprotected this high up and this far into German land. A voice suddenly came over his radio, filled with rising panic. "Single-engine fighters high above with extra fuel tanks." Kogler felt a chill run down his spine. American fighters and single-engine ones were here, over Brandenburg, not even 50 miles from Berlin. That couldn't be happening. No Allied single-engine plane had the ability to travel so far into Germany and make it back to England. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. And if stories of heroes appearing in the darkest hour thrill you, then hit subscribe, because we're just getting started. The longest reach of the American P-47 Thunderbolt was Arcan, which barely touched German airspace. The two-engine P-38 Lightning might get to Hanover if things went well, but Brandenburg or Berlin itself. This discovery destroyed every plan, every thought, every defense plan the German Air Force had made since the American bombing runs started in the daytime. As Kogler saw the shiny silver shapes get bigger, their unique square wings and smooth shapes becoming clear to see, he knew with total certainty that he was seeing the start of the end. These weren't the short Thunderbolts or the twin-tailed Lightnings they had gotten used to fighting at the very limit of their travel distance. These were North American P-51B Mustangs, and they flew through the air with the calm sureness of hunters who knew they had fuel to spare, height to their advantage, and all the time they needed to find their prey. 730 heavy bombers from the 8th Air Force were nearing Berlin. This wasn't the usual move toward the capital before switching to other targets, but a straight-on attack on the center of the Third Reich. And for the very first time in the story of air combat, single-engine fighters would guard them all the way there and all the way back. What Kogler and his group of 7 twin-engine Me-110s and Me-410s and 9 Bf-109s didn't realize was that this event would set off the deepest mental breakdown in the history of air forces. It was a total destruction not just of planes and pilots, but of the very idea that had kept German air power strong since 1939. The numbers of total destruction were being written not in the meeting rooms of the Air Ministry, but in the white trails streaking across the Brandenburg sky at 28,000 feet. The shock had really started to grow weeks earlier, though not many in the German Air Force Command had put the pieces together. On January 11, 1944, Major Hermann Graf, in charge of JG-11, had run into American single-engine fighters near Brunswick, 150 miles deeper into Germany than they should have been able to go. His report after the fight, which guessed these fighters must have gotten more fuel at hidden bases in Sweden, was brushed off by Berlin as a sign of battle tiredness affecting his thinking. But more and more sightings happened. Hanover on January 29th, Magdeburg on February 3rd. Each report pushed the known limit of American fighter distance further east, and each one was met with an official refusal to believe it. The German Air Ministry sent out a notice on February 15th saying for sure that reports of American single-engine fighters past the Ruhr area were mistakes, and that pilots were likely seeing twin-engine P-38s or friendly planes. Pilots making such reports would have to get a medical checkup. The real story was much more unsettling than Swedish plots or pilot daydreams. At Wright Field in Ohio, American engineers had done what German technical minds had said was physically not possible. They had stretched the P-51B Mustang's fighting range to over 650 miles by using disposable extra fuel tanks. The math seemed to go against the basic rules of flight. A single-engine fighter carrying enough fuel to fly 1,300 miles while still being able to fight was, according to German thinking, an engineering feat that couldn't be done. Hauptmann Heinz Knocke, who led the 2nd Squadron of Jagdgeschwader 11, wrote in his journal in early 1944, "We had figured it out exactly. The American single-engine fighters could guard their bombers 280 miles from their bases in England, and not a mile more. This left us all of central and eastern Germany as a place to hunt, where we could attack the bomber groups without anyone bothering us. It was simple math. Fuel amount divided by usage rate gives you the distance. The Americans couldn't change the laws of science, but the Americans hadn't changed the laws of science. They had just used them more cleverly than anyone in the German high command had ever thought possible. The key was not in the plane itself, but in two game-changing new ideas that German spies had either not found or had ignored as false information: the Packard-built Merlin engine and the British-made paper drop tanks. The Packard V1653 engine in the P-51B was not just a licensed version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin. It was a better version, made with a level of care that was even higher than the original British standards. Using American factory methods perfected in Detroit's car plants, Packard had done something amazing: an engine that made 490 horsepower at sea level and, importantly, kept over 200 horsepower at 30,000 feet, thanks to its advanced supercharger. Oberfeldwebel Konrad Bauer, a technical expert with JG-26, looked at a crashed P-51B near Gütersloh in February 1944. His report, found in German Air Force files after the war, shows how amazed the Germans were. The engine setup is a work of art in engineering skill. The intercooler system by itself is more advanced than anything in our Daimler-Benz 605, but what's most amazing is the build quality. Every part is made with the precision of a jeweler, yet they say the Americans make 3 of these engines every hour. If that's true, this is not a war of pilots, but of factory lines. The drop tanks were an even smarter answer. Made from pressed paper soaked in plastic glue, these 108-gallon extra tanks weighed only 35 pounds when empty, less than the bullets for one of the Mustang's machine guns. British engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment had created the method of using layers of craft paper, which could hold fuel for about 5 hours before starting to weaken. This was more than enough for the 2.5-hour trip to Berlin. German engineers had tried extra tanks, but their way of thinking showed a basic difference in their approach. The German tanks were metal, meant to be reused, cost a lot, and were heavy. They hurt performance so much that fighters carrying them were easy targets. The American paper tanks were cheap, throwaway, and light. A P-51B with 2 108-gallon drop tanks could fly to Berlin, drop the tanks in a few seconds when a fight started, and fly with its full power. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, leading the 56th Fighter Group, described the huge change in tactics in a 1944 meeting. The Germans thought we would save our fuel, to have enough for fighting and the trip back. But with drop tanks, we could use fuel like we were rich. We could fly to Berlin on the outside tanks, let them go, and still have our full inside fuel for 30 minutes of fighting at full power, plus the flight back. We weren't flying on the edge of our limits anymore. We had plenty to spare. To grasp the mental shock of March 6, 1944, you first have to understand the terrible experience of October 14, 1943, known as Black Thursday. On that day, the 8th Air Force had tried to bomb the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt without long-distance fighter protection. Out of 291 B-17 flying fortresses that flew into German airspace that day, 60 were shot down and 138 were damaged, a loss of 20.6%, with over 600 airmen lost. The German Air Force had shown with harsh skill that bombing in the daytime without protection could not be continued. General Ira Eaker, leading the 8th Air Force, had to stop deep-fly raids completely. General Major Adolf Galland, the general of fighters, called October 14th the greatest win of the fighter force in the defense war. In his book After the War, The First and the Last, he wrote, "After Schweinfurt, we thought we had shown that daytime precision bombing was a failed idea. The Americans would have to join the British in bombing at night, where hitting targets was hard and damage was small. We had won the argument, but Galland, as smart a planner as he was, had made a big mistake in judgment. He thought the Americans would live with the limits of the technology they had instead of creating new answers. When news of a new American fighter with amazing range started to reach him in December 1943, he ignored them. When his own pilots said they saw single-engine fighters over Hanover in January 1944, he told them they were seeing things. It wasn't until February 20th, 1944, the first day of Big Week, that Galland started to see the great size of the danger. The Americans sent out 1,000 bombers with 835 fighter guards, including the first big use of P-51Bs. Over the next 5 days, the German Air Force lost 262 fighters and, even more importantly, 100 skilled pilots, 17% of their available veteran fighter group. Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, Adolf's younger brother who led 3 JG-26, reported after Big Week, "The sight of Mustangs changed it all. Before, we could get in position beyond the fighter range and attack the bombers in a planned way. Now we had to fight through guards just to get to the bombers, then fight our way back. Every mission turned into a fight for our lives from the moment we took off to the moment we landed." The morning of March 6, 1944, was clear and cold across northern Europe. Perfect weather for flying. At RAF Leiston in England, ground teams had worked all night, getting the 357th Fighter Group ready for the most daring mission ever tried. The first P-51 group to give protection all the way to Berlin. Colonel Henry Spicer, in charge of the 357th Fighter Group, told his pilots at 6 a.m., "Gentlemen, today we go to Big B, the whole way. We'll be over enemy land for 4 hours. Any pilot who doesn't think his plane is in perfect shape should turn back now. There won't be any second chances at these distances." No one turned back. But Colonel Spicer himself had to turn back soon after takeoff because of engine trouble, leaving Major Thomas L. Hayes to lead the historic mission. At 8:30 a.m., 730 heavy bombers started to take off from bases all over East Anglia. Behind them, 796 fighters got ready to give protection in shifts. P-47s for the first part, P-38s for the middle part, and P-51 Mustangs for the deepest flight and target protection. The 357th Fighter Group sent up 48 P-51Bs, but only 33 would make it to Berlin because of mechanical problems and trouble finding their way in thick clouds. In Germany, the country's air defense radar stations started to see the huge group as it formed over the North Sea. The trackers at Doberitz, the main fighter control center for Berlin's defense, at first thought this was another trick. The Americans had come near Berlin before, but they always turned away to hit targets in western Germany. Oberst Hannes Trautloft, in charge of the 2nd Fighter Division that protected Berlin, looked at the map and made a life-changing choice. He would keep his fighters on the ground until the bombers showed they were really going for their target. There was no reason to waste fuel if this was another trick. At 11:30 a.m., the first bombers flew into German airspace near Arnhem. The guarding P-47s fought German fighters that were taking off from bases in Holland and western Germany. Everything was going as it usually did. The German Air Force pilots fought carefully, waiting for the moment they knew would come, when the American guards ran low on fuel and had to turn back. At 12:55 p.m., as the line of bombers got close to Berlin, Major Hans Kogler led his mixed group to meet what they thought would be unprotected bombers. His group had 7 Messerschmitt Bf-110 night fighters that were being used in the daytime, along with 41 single-engine Bf-109s. German controllers had seen the P-47s turning back and thought the bombers were now open to attack. Major Thomas Hayes, leading the 357th Fighter Group's 33 Mustangs that had made it to Berlin through tough weather, later wrote about the moment in his fight report. "We came out of the cloud layer to see B-24 Liberators below us and to our left. At the same time, we saw about 40 enemy planes getting ready to attack. Mi-110s, Mi-410s, and Mi-109s. They hadn't seen us yet. We were higher up and had total surprise. The German group, looking only at the bombers, never saw the Mustangs until it was too late. Hayes dove on the enemy fighters, shouting, 'Greenhouse Squadron, this is Greenhouse Leader. Bad guys at 2 o'clock low, drop your tanks and attack.' Feldwebel Jan Müller of JG-11, flying one of the guarding Bf-109s, lived through the fight and later talked about it. We were in the perfect spot, just starting our dive to attack the bombers when bullets flew past my cockpit window. I looked up to see single-engine fighters with American marks diving on us from high above. It was impossible. We were over Berlin. My first thought was that these must be planes they had captured, some kind of trick. But then I saw the drop tanks falling away, lots of them, and I knew these were real American fighters with a range we had never dreamed of. What happened next was not a fight, but a slaughter. The German fighters, caught totally by surprise and in a bad spot, scattered in a mess. In 12 minutes of fighting, The 357th Fighter Group said they destroyed 20 enemy planes without losing a single P-51. Hayes himself shot down a Bf-109 at a low height near Wilson, then led other Mustangs in shooting up a German airfield. At his home at Karenhall, 50 miles north of Berlin, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring was eating lunch when the call came from General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland. American fighters were over Berlin. Single-engine fighters. "You're wrong, Galland," Göring said simply. "Check your reports again." "Herr Reichsmarschall, I have visual proof from many sources. P-51 Mustangs are fighting our fighters over Potsdam right now." Göring's anger was explosive. According to his helper, Oberst Bernd von Brauchitsch, who was there, the Reichsmarschall threw his wine glass against the wall and yelled, "This is betrayal! Sabotage!" The pilots are lying to hide their fear. "I will have every man who makes such a report court-martialed." But even as Göring yelled, the proof could not be argued against. From his own home, he could see the white trails over Berlin and hear the far-off sound of plane engines at full power. His helper would later say that Göring stood at the window for almost an hour, watching the sky and saying nothing. That evening, Göring gave his most famous order of the air war. Any pilot who says he saw American single-engine fighters over Berlin is to be arrested for being a coward and spreading negative talk. The longest range of American fighters is the Ruhr. This is a scientific fact. The order caused a mess in fighter groups that were already shaken by their losses. Pilots who had just lived through a fight against P-51s were now being told they would be court-martialed for reporting what they had seen. Several squadron leaders, like Major Gunther Rahl, just ignored the order and told their pilots to report twin-engine fighters in their fight reports. General Major Galland, in a tense meeting at the Air Ministry on March 8th, showed Göring a piece of a P-51's drop tank, clearly marked, "Made in USA," and found in a field near Magdeburg. Göring's answer became a famous story in the German Air Force. "I don't care if you bring me a whole Mustang on a silver plate. The Americans cannot guard to Berlin. It's scientifically impossible." It was at this moment, according to Galland's book, that he knew Germany had lost the war. Later at Nuremberg, Göring would say, "When I saw American fighters over Berlin, I knew the game was over." For individual German Air Force pilots, the sight of Mustangs over Berlin was not just a tactical surprise, but a crisis of their very being. These were men who had been told over and over that they were protecting an unbeatable fort, that German science and engineering were better than anything the Allies could make. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke, leading the 2nd Squadron of Jagdgeschwader 11, wrote in his journal on March 7, 1944, "Yesterday changed it all. We had always known where we were safe, where we could regroup, where we could attack without anyone bothering us. That feeling of safety is gone. If they can get to Berlin, they can get anywhere. We are no longer the hunters, but the hunted, even over our own capital city." The mental shock was made worse by the skill of the enemy. The P-51B was not just flying over Berlin, it was in control. Its Merlin engine gave it a top speed of 437 mph at 25,000 feet, faster than the Bf-109G6's 386 mph at the same height. Its special wing design gave it great handling at high altitudes. Its .450 caliber machine guns gave it strong firepower. And most importantly, its pilots were fresh. Not tired from hours of fighting at the edge of their fuel supply, Unteroffizier Werner Peace of JG 301 lived through a fight with P-51s on March 9th and described it. "They came from above and behind, always with the height advantage. When we turned to fight, they would zoom climb away. They had the power to go straight up whenever they wanted. When we tried to dive away, they followed with ease. They fought like they had endless fuel, making many passes, following us down to low heights. We were used to American fighters that had to be careful with their fuel, that would make one pass and then fly home. These Mustangs toyed with us like cats with mice." Johannes Steinhoff, in charge of JG 77, would later write about the big change in plans. "We had to believe every bomber group had Mustang protection, even if we couldn't see them. No more big group attacks, no more taking time to get in position. We had to go in right away with whatever we had, take higher losses, and hope to get to the bombers before the Mustangs found us." The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin happened at the same time as and sped up, another problem that was slowly killing the German Air Force: a lack of fuel. Germany had always relied on making synthetic fuel, turning coal into airplane gasoline through a special process. This needed huge industrial factories that were easy targets for precision bombing. Before March 1944, these synthetic fuel plants had been mostly safe from attack. They were too far from England for accurate bombing with fighter protection. The math was simple. Without protection, bombers couldn't last over the target long enough for accurate bombing. Without accuracy, the huge concrete buildings of the fuel plants were not likely to be seriously hurt. The Mustang changed this picture in one night. On May 12, 1944, the 8th Air Force began its first big attack against the synthetic fuel plant at Luna, 100 miles southwest of Berlin. 800 bombers, guarded by 735 fighters, including 298 P-51s, dropped 1,618 tons of bombs with amazing accuracy. Production at Luna fell by 90% in one night. By June 1944, German airplane fuel production had dropped from 175,000 tons a month to 35,000 tons. By September, it was down to 7,000 tons, barely enough to fuel 500 flights a day on all fronts. Training flights were stopped completely. New pilots were being sent into battle with as little as 50 hours of total flight time, compared to the 250 hours that had been normal in 1942. A veteran pilot who had moved from the Eastern Front to defend Germany described the worsening situation. By summer 1944, we were allowed one training flight a week, then one a month, then none at all. New pilots came to our units having never fired their guns in the air, never practiced flying in a group, never done a practice fight. They were lambs being sent to be killed. The shortage wasn't just fuel, it was skill, belief, everything that makes a fighter pilot. The true sign of the Mustang's effect became clear on June 6, 1944, D-Day. The biggest sea invasion in history needed total air control over the beaches. The Allies flew 14,674 flights on D-Day. The German Air Force managed 319, losing 35 planes in the effort. Over the actual invasion beaches, only 2 German fighters showed up the whole day. Oberst Joseph Pips Priller, in charge of JG-26, led the only German Air Force attack on the invasion beaches. With his wingman, Unteroffizier Heinz Wodarczyk, he made a single strafing run on Sword Beach before being chased off by Spitfires. In his book After the War, Priller wrote, "2 planes. That's all we could send against the biggest invasion in history. Not because we didn't have courage, but because we didn't have fuel. We didn't have planes, and most of all, we didn't have air control. The Mustangs had taken that from us months before, not over Normandy, but over Berlin." Major Nowotny, who had led 3 JG-54 and claimed a P-51 on May 24, 1944, thought about the overall situation. After the Mustangs showed up over Berlin, we never got the lead back. We were always reacting, always defending, always outnumbered. The Americans could attack anywhere at any time with fighter protection. We could barely defend our own airfields. The war in the air was lost the moment they could get to Berlin. In hopelessness, the German Air Force came up with tactics that were more and more like suicide. The Sturmgruppe, or assault group idea, was a perfect example of this hopelessness. FW-190A8s were changed with extra armor, 30mm cannons, and stronger windshields. These flying tanks would charge straight through fighter screens to attack bombers at very close range. Major Walter Dahl, who had taken charge of JG-300 on June 27, 1944, became the most famous supporter of these tactics. On July 7, 1944, Dahl led IV Bachat Sturm JG-3 with help from 2 groups of Bf-109s from JG-300 in a huge attack against B-24 Liberators near Leipzig. The heavily armored FW-190s managed to destroy a whole squadron of 12 B-24s from the 492nd Bomb Group in less than a minute, but the price was disastrous. Of the assault group fighters sent out, 9 were shot down and 3 crash-landed. The guarding Bf-109s did even worse against the Mustang guards. The tactics that had worked for a short time in July became more and more deadly as American fighter numbers grew. Oberfeldwebel Conrad Bauer, one of the few assault group pilots to live through many missions, described the situation. "We were flying coffins. The armor that was supposed to keep us safe made us so slow that the Mustangs could make multiple shooting runs with ease. The order was to ram if our guns jammed. But how could we ram when we couldn't even get to the bombers through the fighter screen? Every mission was like Russian roulette with all the guns loaded. Germany's last hope was in new technology. The Messerschmitt Me-262 Schwalbe, or Swallow, the world's first working jet fighter. With a top speed of 540 mph, it was 100 mph faster than the P-51D. In the hands of skilled pilots, it could have changed the air war. But the Me-262 came too late and with too few planes. More importantly, Hitler's demand that it be used as a blitz bomber instead of a fighter to stop bombers wasted valuable months. By the time many were ready for fighter use in late 1944, the German Air Force didn't have the fuel to train pilots to fly them or the airfields to use them safely. Adolf Galland, who had been fired as General of Fighters for his complaints about Hitler's plans, was given command of JV-44, a top jet unit started in February 1945. Even with Germany's best living pilots flying the world's most advanced fighter, they could not beat the huge number of Allied forces. Galland himself described the uselessness. We would take off, shoot down 1 or 2 bombers or fighters, and land to find our airfield being attacked by Mustangs. They hunted us on the ground, catching Me-262s when they were most open during takeoff and landing. For every minute we were in the air, Mustangs were above us for an hour. Technology without numbers, fuel, and support systems is worthless. By the fall of 1944, the German Air Force was going through what historians would later call the death of the expert. The veteran pilots, who had won dozens or even hundreds of battles, were being killed faster than new ones could be trained. The sight of Mustangs deep inside Germany meant there was no safe place to train new pilots, no quiet area where beginners could get experience. The numbers tell a sad story. In 1940, new German Air Force pilots got 250 hours of flight training before battle. By 1944, this was cut to 80 hours. By early 1945, some pilots were sent into battle with as little as 20 hours in that type of plane. At the same time, American pilots coming to England had 400 to 500 hours of flight time, including 100 hours in that type of plane and a lot of gun practice. Johannes Steinhoff, who would live through terrible burns when his Me-262 crashed on takeoff in April 1945, later thought, "We were sending children to their deaths. Boys who could barely fly in a group were supposed to fight Mustang pilots with hundreds of battle hours. It wasn't a fight. It was murder." I stopped looking at the new pilots' faces. I knew most would be dead in a week. The loss numbers prove this view. In January 1945, the average time a new German Air Force fighter pilot was expected to live was 7 missions. Some units had a 100% change of pilots in a month. JG-301, once a top unit, lost 82 pilots in the first 3 months of 1945 while only claiming 41 wins. Lieutenant Gerhard Teiben, who lived through the war with 3 wins, gave a new pilot's view. My first mission was meant to be a training flight, a patrol over Brunswick with skilled pilots. We were jumped by Mustangs before we even got into proper formation. My flight leader was killed in the first pass. I never saw the Mustang that shot at me, only the bullets going past my cockpit. I dove down to the treetops and flew home by myself. That was my battle training. While the German Air Force was bleeding in the skies, American bombing was steadily destroying German plane production. The Mustang's long range meant no factory was safe. The big production centers at Regensburg, Augsburg, Wiener Neustadt, and Leipzig were hit again and again with deadly accuracy. Albert Speer, the Reich Minister for Armaments and War Production, said after the war, "The Mustang allowed the Americans to keep constant pressure on our aircraft industry. We would fix a factory, start making planes again, and in a few days it would be destroyed again. We started to spread out production to caves and forests. But this raised costs and lowered output by 75%. We were making more fighters in 1944 than in 1943, but we couldn't make them fast enough to cover our losses, and we had neither fuel to fly them nor pilots to fly them. The numbers prove this. German fighter production hit its highest point at 3,031 planes in September 1944, but losses that month were 3,217. The German Air Force was literally losing planes faster than the world's most skilled industrial economy could make them. Also, the quality of quickly made planes from spread-out factories was getting worse. Engine problems, weak frames, and system failures were common in new planes. Oberingenieur Kurt Tank, the designer of the FW-190, visited frontline units in December 1944 and was shocked by what he saw. Planes were being sent with serious problems. Engines that should last for 100 hours were failing after 10. Control surfaces were getting stuck. Guns were not aimed right. We had gone from making the world's best fighters to pushing out flying death traps. The workers were tired, the materials were poor, and there was no testing. We were hurting ourselves. On January 1st, 1945, the German Air Force started Operation Bodenplatte, a huge surprise attack on Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands. 900 fighters, almost all of the remaining strength of the German Air Force in the West, took off at sunrise. Many pilots were on their first battle mission. Most had never flown in groups larger than 4 planes. The mission was so secret that German anti-aircraft units weren't told, leading to terrible friendly fire events. The attack was a total tactical surprise. 305 Allied planes were destroyed on the ground and 190 were damaged. But the cost was disastrous. The German Air Force lost 271 planes and, more importantly, 213 pilots, including many skilled leaders that couldn't be replaced. 3 Geschwaderkommodore, 6 Gruppenkommandeure, and 14 Staffelkapitäne were killed or captured. Major Günther Specht, who lived through the mission, called it the death ride of the German Air Force. We destroyed planes that the Americans replaced in a week. We lost pilots we could never replace. Worse, we used up our last supplies of fuel. After Bodenplatte, we were a finished force. We could no longer even try to fight for the skies. The American answer was fast and harsh. Within 48 hours, Mustang groups were systematically hunting down the weakened German fighter units. Airfields were shot up again and again. In the week after Bodenplatte, the German Air Force lost another 400 planes, mostly destroyed on the ground. Major John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group, who had 24 air victories, described the time after Bodenplatte. It was almost sad. We'd find German airfields full of planes that couldn't fly because they had no fuel. We'd shoot them up, they'd burn, and there would be no one to fight back. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was an execution. As 1945 went on, the German Air Force stopped being an effective force. Single pilots still flew single missions, but working together was impossible. The sight of Mustangs over any German airfield meant it would likely be destroyed. Pilots started to refuse to fly, not because they were cowards, but because they logically saw that taking off meant they would surely die with no chance of changing the war's result. The mental effect was terrible. Heinz Knoke, who had once written with excitement about defending Germany, made his last journal entry that was published. "I have lost so many friends in this unit. Boys I trained, boys I flew with, boys I loved like brothers, all gone. For what? We can't even get to the bombers anymore. The Mustangs are all over. They control our sky. I am no longer a fighter pilot. I am a target waiting to be killed." The German Air Force's own files, taken after the war, tell the story in plain numbers. January 1944, 2 395 fighter pilots ready for duty. June 1944, 153 fighter pilots ready, D-Day. January 1945, 742 fighter pilots ready. April 1945, about 200 fighter pilots still flying. Of the German Air Force pilots who were active on January 1st, 1944, less than 5% lived through the war without injury. The sight of Mustangs over Berlin had started a total destruction that wiped out a whole generation of German flyers. After the war, the living German Air Force pilots were surprisingly honest about the effect of the P-51 Mustang. Their stories, gathered by Allied intelligence officers and later by historians, give a special look into the mental breakdown of a force that was once in control. Adolf Galland, even with his wartime firing and arguments with the Nazi leaders, was still one of the most trusted voices on the German Air Force's loss. In a 1954 talk, he said, "The P-51 Mustang was the key weapon in the air war over Germany. It wasn't the best fighter in every way. The Spitfire turned better. The FW-190 rolled better. The Me-262 was faster. But the Mustang was very good at everything and could fly anywhere. Once it showed up over Berlin, we knew the war was lost. It was like a chess game where your enemy suddenly has queens that can go anywhere on the board. Johannes Steinhoff, who lived through terrible burns when his Me-262 crashed on takeoff in April 1945, later became Chief of Staff of the post-war German Air Force and head of the NATO Military Committee. His view was just as direct. The Mustang didn't just beat the German Air Force, it destroyed the very idea of German air control. We had built our whole defense plan on the idea that Germany itself was beyond the reach of single-engine fighters. When that idea turned out to be wrong, everything fell apart. It wasn't just a tactical loss. It was a strategic disaster from which we never bounced back. Maybe the most touching story came from Heinz Knoke, whose journal had followed the whole story from belief to breakdown. At a 1975 meeting of old enemies, he met Colonel Clarence Bud Anderson, a triple ace who had flown Mustangs with the 357th Fighter Group. Knoke told him, "You have to understand, when we saw your Mustangs over Berlin that first time, it was like finding out the ocean had no shore. We had been told we were winning, that America was too far away to harm us. Then all of a sudden you were there, over our capital, with fuel left over. It broke something inside us, not just our drive to fight, but our trust in everything we had been told." Eric Hartmann, the war's top ace with 352 wins, survived by creating special anti-Mustang tactics. He would only attack when he had every advantage and would leave right away if Mustangs showed up. In his talks after the war, he admitted, "Fighting Mustangs was not battle as we knew it. It was about staying alive. They had every advantage: numbers, height, fuel, and more, pilot skill. We could only hope to live and maybe catch a single plane off guard." The statistical effect of the P-51 Mustang on the air war over Europe can be seen in plain numbers that show both the size of American success and the total German loss. Planes destroyed. P-51 Mustangs claimed 4,950 air victories in Europe, plus another 4,131 enemy planes destroyed on the ground. This was 48.9% of all USAAF fighter claims in the European area. Loss rates. P-51 battle loss rate was 1.2% per flight. The German Air Force fighter loss rate by 1945 was 18% per flight. Overall win ratio, about 3.6 to 1 for the P-51, bomber protection. Before the Mustang, the bomber loss rate was 9.1% per mission. After the Mustang, the bomber loss rate was 2.5% per mission, a drop in bomber crew losses of 68%. Range change, P-47. Thunderbolt fighting range was 375 miles. P-38 Lightning fighting range was 450 miles. P-51B C Mustang fighting range was 650 miles with drop tanks. P-51D Mustang fighting range was 750 miles with drop tanks. This meant 100% of German land was within P-51 range. Production power. Total P-51s made was 15,686. The highest production rate was 320 per month. The cost per plane was $51,000 in 1945. German fighter production in 1944 was 25,160, but the number of German fighters working at any time was never more than 1,500. Pilot loss. American pilots coming to Europe in 1944 to 45 had an average of 400 hours of flight time. German pilots going into battle in 1944-45 had an average of 80 hours of flight time. The German Air Force pilot survival rate in 1944-45 was less than 15%. The American fighter pilot tour completion rate was 65%. The sight of Mustangs over Berlin was more than a tactical win. It was a huge change in air combat. For the first time ever, one country could send strong air power over all of another big country's land. The effects went far beyond World War II. General Karl Spaatz, in charge of United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, wrote in his after-action report, "The P-51 Mustang gave us air control over Europe. Not just being stronger in the air, which means a continuing fight, but total control. By spring 1944, we could hit any target at any time with losses we could handle. This was not just a military edge, but a mental weapon. German spirit, both in the military and among regular people, broke down when they saw we could get anywhere, anytime." The Mustang led to a series of big effects. Factory shutdown. No German factory was safe. Production had to be moved to less effective hidden places. Travel lines were always being cut. The German economy, already under pressure, began to completely fall apart. Fuel crisis speed up, synthetic fuel plants, which couldn't be reached before, were destroyed one by one. This created a downward spiral. Less fuel meant less pilot training, which meant higher battle losses, which meant even less fuel could be given to training. Tactical air control. With the German Air Force gone from the skies, Allied ground troops could move without fear of harm. The breakout from Normandy, the quick move across France, and the crossing of the Rhine were all possible because German troops could only move at night. Mental breakdown. The sight of American fighters over the country's capital broke the story of German unbeatable strength. People who had been told America was weak and far away watched silver Mustangs fly around above them with no one to stop them. Germany had actually started the war with better technology in many ways. The Bf-109 was likely the world's best fighter in 1939. German pilots were very well trained, with many having battle experience from the Spanish Civil War. German tactics, especially the Finger Four group and energy fighting methods, were new and groundbreaking. But the Mustang was something else. It was a mix of British new ideas, the Merlin engine, American mass production, built by North American aviation using car industry methods, and constant improvement based on battle experience. It was not the creation of a single smart designer, but of teamwork and refinement. The P-51D, which started to show up in May 1944, had many improvements based on battle experience. A bubble cockpit window for 360-degree sight, 650 caliber machine guns with a better bullet feed, the K-14 computing gun sight, stronger wings for more weapons, better radio gear, and the Packard V1657 engine making 1,090 horsepower. Each improvement fixed specific battle problems found by pilots. This system of feedback, battle experience leading to quick design improvements, which led to better battle performance, was something the German system, with its messy leadership and broken production, could not copy. Dr. Kurt Tank, designer of the FW-190, admitted after the war, "We could design planes as good as or better than the Mustang. The Ta-152H was better in many ways, but we could not make them in large numbers, could not fuel them regularly, and could not train pilots to fly them well." The Americans didn't just build a better fighter. They built a better system for designing, making, and using fighters. The German answer to the Mustang showed the deep problems in the Nazi system. Instead of seeing the danger and changing, they refused to see the truth. Instead of focusing on fighters, Hitler wanted more bombers. Instead of keeping their skilled pilots as teachers, they flew them until they died. Instead of admitting they had made a huge mistake in planning, they court-martialed pilots who told the truth. The effect on Germany's famous aces was especially clear. These were men who had won dozens, sometimes hundreds, of battles. They were not just pilots, but signs of German fighting skill. The Mustang time saw them taken out one by one. Major Klaus Mietusch, 72 victories, was killed by P-51s on September 17, 1944. He had lived through 452 battle missions only to be jumped by Mustangs while getting ready for an attack. Oberst Walter Osau, 123 victories, was shot down by P-38s on May 11, 1944. Even the older American fighters were becoming deadly as German pilot skill dropped. Major Hans Philipp, 206 victories, was shot down by P-47s on October 8, 1943, before the Mustangs came in large numbers. But his death was a sign of what was to come. The list goes on. A list of Germany's best pilots taken out one after another. By the end of the war, of the 107 German pilots who had 100 or more victories, 95 were dead, badly hurt, or captured. The Mustang hadn't just beaten the German Air Force. It had wiped out its collective memory. As 1945 started, the German Air Force was more of an idea on paper than a real force. Planes were hidden in forests, painted to look like they were on fake farms or spread out on highway roads. Pilots lived like hunted animals, always moving to stay away from the ever-present Mustangs. Oberst Gordon Golob, one of the few top leaders still alive, gave orders that showed their hopelessness. Planes will take off only when enemy bombers are right above. Longest flight time, 15 minutes. Any pilot in the air longer than 20 minutes will be thought to have run away. The fear of Mustangs had become so strong that many pilots would stop missions at the first report of guarding fighters. Court-martials for being a coward became common, though killing skilled pilots when so few were left was not helpful. Spirit fell apart completely when pilots saw that even winning missions did nothing. The bombers kept coming, the Mustangs kept guarding them, and Germany kept dying. Lieutenant Heinrich Bartels, with 99 victories, was shot down and killed on December 23, 1944, one victory short of becoming a 100-victory ace. His wingman said, 6 Mustangs. They came from above and behind. Heinrich never had a chance. They followed him down, shooting the whole time. Even after his plane was on fire, they kept shooting. They wanted to be sure. This harshness was new. Earlier in the war, there had been some level of respect. Pilots who jumped out were usually not attacked. Damaged planes trying to leave were sometimes allowed to get away. But by 1945, American pilots had seen too many friends die, knew the war's end was close, and wanted to make sure the German Air Force could never get back up. Every German pilot killed was one who couldn't fly the jets or advanced fighters Germany was still trying to build. American Mustang pilots were very much in agreement in their view of how the campaign went. Colonel John C. Meyer, who had 24 air victories, gave this analysis. From March to June 1944, we fought the German Air Force's best team, skilled, aggressive, talented. From June to December, we faced their second string, still dangerous but not as organized. By 1945, we were shooting down students, kids who could barely fly in a group, let alone fight. It wasn't satisfying. It was needed, but sad. Lieutenant Colonel John B. England, leading the 306th Fighter Squadron, noted, "The Mustang didn't just give us range, it gave us mental control. German pilots knew that if they saw Mustangs, they were probably going to die. We could see it in their tactics. Early on, they'd attack with force, even when they were outnumbered. By late 44, they'd run at the first sight of us. By 45, many wouldn't even take off if Mustangs were reported in the area." Captain Charles Chuck Yeager, who would later break the sound barrier, had 11.5 victories in Mustangs. His view was typically direct. The P-51 was a straight-up airplane. It told you what it was going to do. It had no bad habits if you treated it right. Against German fighters in 44 and 45, it was like having a rifle when they had muskets. We had every advantage: speed, range, height, and numbers. It wasn't a fair fight, but war isn't meant to be fair. Maybe the most telling stories came from bomber crews whose lives relied on fighter protection. Technical Sergeant William McManus, a B-17 gunner with the 100th Bomb Group, remembered, "Before the Mustangs, every mission felt like a suicide mission. We'd watch our guards turn back and know the wolves were coming. After March 44, seeing those Mustangs with us all the way to the target and back, it was like having guardian angels. Our loss rate went from probably going to die to probably going to make it home." The P-51's success was not just a win of design, but of production. North American Aviation's factories in Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas, reached production speeds that seemed impossible by German standards. At its highest point in 1944, North American was finishing one Mustang every 63 minutes. The assembly line, copied from car making, broke down building into special stations. Workers became experts at single jobs, reaching speeds and accuracy that were impossible with old-fashioned airplane-making methods. Paul Peters, a production manager at Inglewood, described the system. "We had housewives putting in control cables, teenagers riveting wing panels, men too old for the draft putting together engines. None of them had built an airplane before the war. But the system was so well made that within weeks, they were doing perfect work. We had quality checks at every station. If something wasn't right, the line stopped until it was fixed." The difference with German production was clear. As Allied bombing forced them to spread out, German planes were being put together in caves, forests, and old mines. Different parts might be made hundreds of miles from each other. Quality control was impossible. Workers were often slave laborers who had every reason to mess up production. Oberst Dietrich Rabach, who led various fighter units throughout the war, noted, "We would get new planes that looked perfect, but were flying coffins. Control cables put in wrong, fuel lines that leaked, guns that wouldn't shoot." The Americans were building better planes in bigger numbers with workers who wanted to win. We were building worse planes in smaller numbers with workers who wanted us to lose. The success of the P-51 over Berlin had effects far beyond Europe. It showed that air power could be sent globally. That distance was no longer a block to American reach. This lesson was not missed by Japan, which saw its defense area get smaller as American long-range fighters allowed bombing runs against its home islands. Stalin, too, paid attention. Soviet pilots who flew Lend-Lease P-51s were impressed by their range and sturdiness. The Soviet Air Force started to develop long-range escort fighters, knowing that future wars would need to send power over huge distances. The VVS, Soviet Air Force, got 10 P-51s and tested them a lot, though they were never used in battle by Soviet forces. The Mustang kept serving long after World War II was over. In Korea, F-51s, the name changed in 1948, flew close support missions. The Israeli Air Force used Mustangs in the 1956 Suez Crisis. Various air forces flew Mustangs into the 1980s. The Dominican Air Force stopped using their last F-51D in 1984, 40 years after it first flew over Berlin. But the Mustang's greatest lasting impact was on core beliefs. It proved that air control was not just about controlling the sky over the battlefield, but about controlling the sky over whole countries. Every modern Air Force builds its plan around this lesson, first shown when American fighters appeared over Berlin on March 6, 1944. Behind the numbers and big plans were people, young men, mostly in their early 20s, who found themselves in amazing situations. The sight of Mustangs over Berlin meant different things to different people, but for all, it was a moment of deep understanding. For American pilots, it was proof they were right. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group wrote home, "We flew over Hitler's capital today. Think about that. We took off from England, flew across all of Germany, circled Berlin like we owned it because we did, and flew home. 2 years ago, the Nazis were bombing London. Today, we own the sky over Berlin. It's hard to describe the feeling, pride, power, and the total certainty that we're going to win this war." For German pilots, it was hopelessness. Feldwebel Rudi Müller of JG 302 wrote to his wife, "I saw them today, American fighters over Berlin. Single-engine fighters. It's impossible, but I saw them with my own eyes. If they can get to Berlin, they can get anywhere. There is no safe place left in Germany. How do I tell you that I don't think I'll live through this? How do I explain that everything we believed was wrong?" For German civilians, it was the start of the end of the dream. Ursula von Kardorf from Berlin wrote in her diary, "We were told the Americans were weak, that their Jewish-controlled society could never match German strength. Today, I watched American fighters circle above while our famous German Air Force was nowhere to be found. Everything they told us was a lie. If they lied about this, what else did they lie about?" For Allied bomber crews, it was being saved. Staff Sergeant James McMahon, a ball turret gunner on the B-17. "Lucky lady," remembered. "Seeing those Mustangs form up on us as we got close to Berlin, I'm not afraid to say I cried. For the first time since I started flying missions, I thought I might actually live through this war. Those little friends with the big range saved thousands of us." As the war came to a close, the full size of what the Mustang had done became clear. The German Air Force, which had started the war as probably the world's most powerful air force, had stopped being an effective fighting force. The numbers are shocking. Total German Air Force planes lost from 1944 to 1945, about 45,000. German Air Force pilots killed from 1944 to 1945, about 15,000. The percentage of German Air Force pilots active in January 1944 who lived through the war without injury, less than 5%. German cities destroyed by bombing, 61 with over 50% destruction. German civilian deaths from bombing, 350,000 to 500,000. German factory production lost to bombing, 35 to 40%. These numbers show not just a military loss, but a society falling apart. The Mustang had allowed a campaign that brought war to every German city, every factory, every airfield. There was no back area, no safe place, no break. Hermann Goering, on trial at Nuremberg, was asked when he knew Germany had lost the war. His answer became one of the most famous quotes of the conflict. "When I saw American fighters over Berlin, the game was finished. Everything after that was just a delay, just more dead young men for no reason." It was a surprisingly honest statement from a man not known for being truthful. But even Goering, a master of denial and false belief, could not deny what the Mustang stood for. American factory power mixed with British new ideas, sent across impossible distances with harsh skill. The P-51's journey from a basic idea to a Berlin escort fighter is one of the fastest and most successful airplane development stories in history. The NA-73X first model flew on October 26, 1940, just 102 days after North American Aviation got the request from the British Purchasing Commission. By March 1944, less than 4 years later, it was guarding bombers to Berlin. This speed of creation was matched by constant improvement based on battle experience. Each version had lessons learned. P-51A, Allison engine, limited high-altitude ability. P-51BC, Packard Merlin V1653 engine, completely changed ability above 20,000 feet. P-51D, bubble cockpit, 6 guns, better systems, V1657 engine. P-51H, lighter frame, top performance, never saw battle in Europe. The feedback system, battle experience leading to quick design improvements, was something the German system, with its messy leadership and broken production, could not match. While German engineers made technically great designs like the TA-152H or Me-262, they couldn't improve them based on battle experience or make them in large enough numbers. The sight of Mustangs over Berlin proved the whole American strategic bombing idea. Before the war, thinkers like Billy Mitchell and Julio Duhay had said that bombing could win wars by destroying enemy factories and spirit. But until long-range protection was available, this was just an idea. The Mustang made accurate daytime bombing possible. While the British kept bombing large areas at night, Americans could now drop bombs exactly on specific places: ball-bearing factories, synthetic fuel plants, airplane assembly buildings. The difference in accuracy was huge. British night bombing had an average error of 3 miles. American daytime bombing with fighter protection had an error of 1,000 feet. General Curtis LeMay, who would later lead Strategic Air Command, said, "The P-51 made strategic bombing work. Without it, we would have had to take either losses we couldn't handle or ineffective night bombing. With it, we could systematically destroy specific target groups. We didn't just bomb Germany. We did industrial surgery, taking away their ability to make war. The results were clear. German ball-bearing production cut by 70%. Airplane fuel production cut by 95%. Synthetic rubber production cut by 85%. Railroad travel cut by 75%. Canal travel stopped completely in Western Germany. This precise use of force, made possible by Mustang guards, shortened the war by months or maybe years. Every factory destroyed, every rail line cut, every fuel store burned meant German forces couldn't fight well. The picture of Mustangs over Berlin became one of the famous images of World War II. Alongside the flag raising on Iwo Jima or Soviet soldiers at the Reichstag, it stood for American power, technological strength, and the sureness of Allied victory. For Americans, the Mustang became a symbol of their country's industrial and technological skill. It was shown in war bond posters, Hollywood movies, and post-war parties. The fact that it was designed and built in record time by a company that had never made a fighter before represented the American can-do spirit. For Germans, the Mustang stood for shame and loss. Post-war German books and movies often use the image of American fighters over German cities as a symbol of the government's failure to protect its people. The pain of not being able to defend one's own skies left long-lasting mental marks on the German Air Force veterans who lived. Heinz Knoke, writing in 1953, thought, "For a fighter pilot, the main duty is to protect your homeland's skies. We failed. The Mustangs over Berlin were proof of our failure, seen by every German who looked up. That shame never really goes away." Military groups all over the world still study the Mustang's effect on the European air war as an example of how technology can cause a huge strategic change. The lessons are always relevant. Range gives you choices. The ability to use power at a distance gives you strategic freedom. The Mustang gave Allied leaders choices the Germans couldn't fight. Working together is better than working alone. The Mustang did well not by itself, but as part of a whole system: bombers, fighters, intelligence, supplies, training. The Germans had great individual parts but couldn't put them together well. Production wins wars. Building huge numbers of good planes is better than small numbers of great planes. The Mustang was great, but more importantly, there were thousands of them. Pilot skill is important. Technology without trained users is useless. American pilot training programs, with their focus on flight hours and real battle training, made pilots who could use the Mustang's abilities to the fullest. Changing is key to survival. The Americans always improved tactics, technology, and training based on battle experience. The Germans, stuck with strict rules and political meddling, couldn't change fast enough. Modern air forces use these lessons every day. The focus on long-range attack ability, connected air defense systems, pilot training, and keeping the industrial base all come from lessons learned when Mustangs first appeared over Berlin. The appearance of P-51 Mustangs over Berlin on March 6, 1944, was more than a tactical event. It was the moment Nazi Germany's basic ideas about the war fell apart. The country was supposed to be a fortress, protected by distance, defended by the world's best pilots, flying the world's best fighters. The Mustang broke these dreams in a single morning. For the German leaders, both military and political, it was a moment of awful clearness. They had based their whole plan on the Americans not being able to send power across the Atlantic well. They had ignored American factory ability as not good, American technology as worse, and American pilots as soft. Every idea was wrong, and the Mustangs over Berlin were proof that couldn't be denied, covered up with propaganda, or ignored. Adolf Galland would later write, March 6, 1944 was the day we lost the war. Not when Berlin fell, not when Hitler died, but when American fighters appeared over our capital. Everything after was just the playing out of a sure thing. The Mustang didn't just beat the German Air Force. It proved that American industrial democracy could make more, create more, and fight better than Nazi totalitarianism. The mental effect spread through German society. If the government couldn't protect Berlin from American fighters, what could it do? If everything they'd been told about American weakness was not true, what else was not true? The Mustang became an accidental bringer of truth. Its presence over German cities proved that the Nazi view of the world was built on lies. While the Mustang's success was a deciding factor, it came with a price. 2,520 P-51s were lost in battle in Europe. Behind each loss was a young man who would never return home. The 357th Fighter Group alone lost over 100 pilots killed in action. These were the best America had. College students, athletes, young professionals who chose to fly and fight. Lieutenant Colonel Sidney S. Brooks, the commanding officer of the 339th Fighter Group, was killed on March 31, 1944, when his P-51B was hit by anti-aircraft fire near Brunswick. He was 28 years old, married with 2 children he would never see grow up. His loss was repeated thousands of times. Young men who paid the highest price for the strategic win the Mustang brought. Captain Don Gentile, one of the war's top Mustang aces with 21.83 air victories, lived through battle only to die in a flying accident in January 1951, testing a T-33 jet trainer. The war's effects continued long after the fighting ended. Many Mustang pilots had trouble with what they had seen and done, carrying mental wounds that never fully went away. But what they gave up led to something amazing. They had taken the war to the enemy's home, forced the enemy to fight over his own land, and won for sure. The German Air Force never recovered from the sight of Mustangs over Berlin. From that day on, it was a broken force, able to give only scattered, weak resistance. As the sun came up on May 8, 1945, VE Day, American Mustangs patrolled the skies over a beaten Germany. There was no one to fight. The German Air Force that had once scared Europe, that had seemed unbeatable in 1940, was gone. Its planes were destroyed or on the ground with no fuel. Its pilots were dead, hurt, or prisoners. Its support systems were in ruins. The change from March 6, 1944 to May 8, 1945, just 14 months, is one of the most total military wins in history. The P-51 Mustang had been the key to that win, the tool that turned Allied air power from a costly problem into a force that couldn't be stopped. In those 14 months, Mustang pilots had flown over 213,000 missions, claimed 4,950 air victories, destroyed 4,131 planes on the ground, dropped 31,000 tons of bombs, and fired 99 million rounds of bullets. Behind these numbers was a human story. Young American men, average age 22, Flying aluminum planes powered by Packard-built Merlin engines had completely destroyed one of history's strongest air forces. They had done it not through single acts of bravery, though there was a lot of that, but through better technology, training, tactics, and factory support. Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, one of the war's most successful fighter leaders, gave maybe the best final words for the German Air Force. They were wonderful enemies who were just beaten by numbers. We had more of everything: more planes, more fuel, more pilots, more training, more range. The Mustang gave us the power to use that more anywhere we wanted. Once we could guard to Berlin, the math of winning was set. When Major Hans Kogler saw those first Mustangs over Brandenburg on March 6, 1944, he saw more than enemy fighters. He saw the future of air combat. The P-51 Mustang had proven that technology could beat distance, that factory power could beat single skill, that a planned approach could beat spur-of-the-moment genius. The shocked German pilots who met Mustangs over Berlin were not just up against a better plane. They were up against the combined factory, technological, and organizational power of the United States, sent across an ocean and deep into the heart of their home country. It was a show of force that broke every idea about what was possible in air combat. Hermann Göring's admission about knowing the war was lost when he saw American fighters over Berlin has become one of history's most telling admissions of defeat. But the full meaning of that moment goes beyond one man's realization or even one country's loss. The sight of Mustangs over Berlin was a basic change in the way war was fought. It was the moment when air power became truly strategic, when factory power became more important than warrior history, when organized skill beat individual heroism. The German pilots who were shocked by Mustangs over Berlin had seen something that would be felt through the years: the sending of American power across huge distances with accuracy and overwhelming force. Every modern military action, from Korea to Kosovo, from Vietnam to the Gulf War, has been built on the foundation laid when those first Mustangs appeared in the skies over Brandenburg. In the end, the P-51 Mustang did more than guard bombers or shoot down German fighters. It broke the last illusions of a government built on lies about racial strength and national purpose. It proved that free societies, even with their seeming messiness and lack of skill, could organize, create, and send power more effectively than totalitarian countries. It showed that technology and industry, when used right, could beat any defensive edge of land or position. The German Air Force pilots who looked up in shock at those silver Mustangs on March 6, 1944, were seeing their own future of being outdated. Within 14 months, their whole force would be destroyed, their country taken over, their beliefs proven wrong. The shock of seeing impossible American fighters over Berlin was the start of a series of truths that would end with Germany's total loss and change. Today, saved P-51 Mustangs still fly at air shows. Their unique Merlin engines make a sound that veterans of that time know right away. For American veterans, it's the sound of victory. For German veterans, it's the sound that signaled the start of the end. For historians, it's the sound that changed warfare forever, the moment when one country proved it could send strong air power anywhere in the world. The story of German Air Force pilots shocked by P-51 Mustangs over Berlin is, in the end, a story about the clash between ideas and reality, between propaganda and truth, between what was thought impossible and what American industry made normal. When those Mustangs appeared over Berlin, they didn't just shock the German Air Force pilots who saw them. They shocked a whole way of thinking into non-existence. But from that ruin would come something new. Many of the German pilots who lived through the shock of Mustangs over Berlin would help build the post-war Air Force of a democratic Germany, working with the very country whose fighters had destroyed their friends. Johannes Steinhoff would rise to become Chief of Staff of the new German Air Force and eventually head of the NATO Military Committee. In 1983, he would stand next to American generals who had flown Mustangs against him, joined in defending the freedom that his old enemies had brought to his beaten country. This change from deadly enemies to strong friends was maybe the most profound shock of all. The Mustangs that had appeared over Berlin hadn't just brought destruction. They had, in the end, brought freedom. The German pilots, who had been shocked by their appearance in 1944, would in time come to understand that those American fighters had freed them from a criminal government that had led them to ruin. The last word belongs to Adolf Galland, the German Air Force's general of fighters, who had denied, then seen, then lived through the Mustang attack. In 1984, at a meeting of American and German fighter pilots in San Antonio, Texas, he raised a glass to his old enemies and said, "You shocked us when your Mustangs appeared over Berlin. You shocked us with your industry, your technology, your resolve. But the biggest shock came after the war, when you helped us rebuild, when you protected us from Soviet aggression, when you became our friends. The Mustangs over Berlin didn't just end a war, they started a peace. For that, we who survived are forever thankful." The circle was complete. The shock that had started with Hans Kogler's horrified realization of American fighters over Brandenburg had changed through loss and rebuilding into partnership and friendship. The Mustangs had indeed changed the sky forever, not just the sky over Berlin on March 6, 1944, but the strategic sky under which all countries have lived ever since. In that change lies the true legacy of the P-51 Mustang, not just as a tool of victory, but as a force for the post-war world order that came after. The shocked German Air Force pilots of March 1944 could never have guessed that the American fighters, destroying their force, would, in the end, lead to their country's recovery and joining a community of democratic nations. Yet that is exactly what happened. The Mustangs that shocked the German Air Force over Berlin didn't just win a war, they helped win a peace that has lasted for 8 decades. In the end, that may be their greatest victory of all.